Okay, so over here on the wall, on the just left to the sink in the ceramics room, you'll see all these containers of Terra Sigillatas. These are what we're going to put onto our pinch pots before we go ahead and fire them. There's 2 rows of them here, so there's a handful of different options. And then there's also sitting next to them up on the shelf tiles showing what they look like. So that's where you'll find them. So you'll just need to grab a color or colors that look good for you, and we'll start applying them here in a second. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start applying Terra Sigillata to this piece. This is now at what we call the bone dry phase. You know, it's all very light gray everywhere. If your piece hasn't hit the bone dry phase, you need to wait until it has. So if that can't be done, you know, today, Thursday the 27th in class, that's okay. Next Tuesday, it could happen, or you could come in between now and then. You know, it's about doing it at the right stage, not necessarily getting it done the quickest. So at this point, I can also, you know, once the clay's hit this bone dry stage, it's really hard to do very much to it. We can't make any more attachments. We can carve like maybe some fine lines into it, but it's going to be a real dusty mess. But if there's any sort of, like we talked a little bit about, like boogery type things on the surface, you know, I could kind of wipe them away if I wanted to. Any crummy kind of things on the inside, if I can get my hand down in there, I'd want to get rid of, just to clean that surface up. And I want to be also careful at this point not to take a wet sponge to the surface. That will not smooth out the surface. It will actually make it rougher. So there's not really much I can do with a bone dry piece. Except get it ready to bisque fire or put Terra Sigillata on it. Later we'll talk about slips, we'll talk about glazes. None of those things can go on at the bone dry phase. This is really the only thing that can happen. And so I've got, I'm going to do 2 different ones. And as we apply these, I'm going to use 2 different ones, but I'm also going to be very careful with how I use them. So I'm going to use this sort of purplish one down here on the bottom, and then I'm going to use the yellow-orange one here on top. I want to make sure that they don't cover each other. They don't mix. You know, when we use slips, glazes, Terra Sigillatas, nothing mixes like paint. So we want to be really aware of that. Like I couldn't take a blue and a yellow and make a green. It doesn't work like that. So before I use this, I want to go ahead and make sure that the lid's on really nice and tight, and then just give it a big shake. Because obviously it'll make a giant mess if I do it otherwise. And then so this is one of those, I could pour this into a little container if I had one, or I can just go right out of the bottle, just kind of depending on what sort of level of interest there is at the moment. So I'm just going to go ahead and start painting this on the surface. Move that out of the shot. And the way we want to think about using these, you know, these don't really work in, you know, maybe a linear fashion. You know, I want to just kind of brush over broadly over the entire surface. And with this Terra Sigillata material, I can put it on the bottom. Later when we talk about glazes, we'll talk about how that's a bad idea. But for the moment, that's okay. And as you can see, there's already a pretty big color change starting to happen, and so this stuff dries pretty fast. A lot of the surfacing agents that we use under slip, glaze, Terra Sigillata, it all works on the foundation of water. Like our clay, it's mixed with water. But then, in this case, the bone dry clay is absorbing the water out of the Terra Sigillata and keeping it stuck to the stuck to the surface, adhered to the surface. You know, it's kind of like a candy shell sort of thing, just living on the surface. And again, you can see it drying in different spots. Up here where it's darker, it's still wet, but down here it's kind of dry. And I'm going to go ahead and in those drier parts, just put a second coat down. And this is just a Terra Sigillata. Is basically a really fine, we've broken down and separated out the really fine particles of clay. And added, in this case, a little bit of manganese to give it a little bit of a purplish hue. And that color is going to change as it fires as well. I know on the first day we looked at Greek pottery. There were some of the most notable pottery for using Terra Sigillatas out there. So all that red and black decoration was made out of Terra Sigillatas. Typically when they found it or when they used them, it was, again, really fine particles of clay. But they found them basically just on in riverbeds. So it's just clay that had been worked over and over and over. We don't get ours from riverbeds. We get it from bags and then just kind of slake it down. But that's a story for another day. So now one of the nice things about Terra Sigillata, since it's going on now at the bone dry phase, and since it's just a really fine particle material, I can take a piece of plastic, and once it's started to dry a little bit on the surface, isn't tacky anymore, I can start rubbing this over the surface and sort of buffing it up to help giving it a little bit shinier of a surface. So again, I want to make sure it's dry, or else the plastic's just going to stick to it. But I also want to make sure that the plastic is clean. Again, as I mentioned the other day, this rim, I don't want to hold it by the rim too much. It's very fragile. I don't want to hold it by the handles. All that's very fragile. So you can see a sheen building up in different areas. I can go ahead and add, usually it takes about 3 coats of this material, buffing in between each layer to get a good sheen to it. Again, my hand's inside supporting, not grasped onto the rim. So now we can go ahead and add the yellow orange.
Now go ahead and add the yellow orange.